All right, so get this. We're going deep today. Trauma. Like, not just in your head, your body. Our listeners sent in some really interesting stuff from Judith Blackstone's book, Trauma and the Unbound Body. And I got to say, this is some next level stuff.
It really is. Blackstone goes way beyond, the usual trauma talk. She brings in this whole concept of fascia.
Fascia. Okay, now, some of our listeners might not be totally up on their anatomy. Could you give us the quick and dirty on what fascia is and why it matters so much?
Sure thing. Imagine, like, this 3D web, okay? It's holding your whole body together. Muscles, organs, bones, everything. That's fascia. And it's not just about, like, how flexible you are or whatever. It affects way more.
So not just stretching after a workout stuff. There's more to it.
Way more. Blackstone's big idea is that trauma, and we're talking big or small traumas here, can like leave these imprints on your fascia. It shapes how you react to the world and you might not even know it.
So a lot of people think trauma, they think huge life-changing events. But Blackstone's saying even little things, especially when you're a kid, can really stick with you.
Exactly. Like she talks about this woman who, when she was little, her punishment was being sent to her room. Not a huge deal, right? But for this woman, even years later, she still felt all this shame and isolation from that. It really shows you how personal trauma is and how deeply it can get woken into us, literally.
Wow. Okay, so we've got this idea that fascia is like a memory bank, holding on to all these past experiences. But how does that even work? How does trauma physically change your fascia?
So think of it like this. Like you've got a balloon and you twist it. What happens? The whole thing changes shape, right? Blackstone says it's kind of like that with fascia. Stress, trauma, they create these like holding patterns, these tight spots.
So we're talking chronic tension, knots, stiffness. That stuff we think is just like part of getting older.
Yeah, but it goes deeper than just feeling creaky. Blackstone argues this tension messes with your emotions, how you deal with things.
This is where it gets really interesting. And we're talking mind-body connection, but like on a whole other level.
Totally. The book talks about how we, without even thinking about it, tense up certain parts of our bodies to block out bad feelings or memories. Like you tighten your chest, maybe to stop feeling sad, or your throat to hold back tears or anger. It's like our bodies are trying to protect us.
Wild, isn't it? And the book even talks about how trauma can like dull your senses to protect you from getting overwhelmed. Makes you think, how many of us are walking around experiencing like a watered down version of life because of some past trauma and we don't even know it?
It's a big thing, and most people don't even realize. There's this powerful story in the book about a man who, as a kid, got whipped a lot. And he learned to tighten his skin so much he couldn't feel anything. No pain, but also no pleasure.
Heartbreaking. But you're right, it's not about weakness, this tensing up. It's survival.
Exactly. Blackstone says it's brilliant, actually. It's how our bodies deal with really tough stuff, especially kids. You're totally dependent on the adults around you, so you learn to shut down certain feelings so you don't rock the boat.
So it's this trade-off. You stay safe, but you maybe don't get to experience life fully. So what do we do? Can we untangle these patterns that have been there for years?
That's where Blackstone introduces the realization process. It's all about becoming aware of and releasing these constrictions. But before we get into that, there's this whole other fascinating thing. Mirroring.
Mirroring? What's that all about?
So we talked about these holding patterns, right? Well, mirroring is this idea that we, without realizing it, pick up the physical and emotional habits of people around us, our parents especially.
Like little kids copying how their mom walks, how their dad talks, that kind of thing.
Yeah, but even more than that, like think about how a kid might unconsciously mirror their parents' facial expressions, their tone of voice, even the way they hold tension in their body. We're always soaking up these patterns.
Because we download a program, especially when we're little.
And that program, it can stick with you even when you're not around that person anymore. Blackstone talks about this guy, a therapist, super empathetic, open guy, but he had this tight throat, couldn't let it go.
So many people just think, oh, it's just childhood, it doesn't matter. What does Blackstone say about that?
She says it matters a lot because when you're a kid, your brain, your body, they're like sponges. Those early experiences, they build the foundation for who you become physically and emotionally.
So even if you don't remember stuff, your body remembers. All that tension, the feelings, they're still there.
Exactly. So we got to be careful and kind. These constrictions, it's not your fault. It's your body trying to survive. So this guy, the therapist, through the realization process, he figures out he's been like copying his dad's way of talking. His dad was this lawyer, super sharp, but kind of like talked down to people.
And even though he knew he didn't like that about his dad, it's like he had absorbed it right into his body. Crazy. It really shows you this stuff could be running the show and you don't even know.
Totally. So then the question is, how do we break free? Is it even possible?
Blackstone seems to think so. She talks about this realization process as a way to like untie these knots and really become who you are, fully. I'm super curious about this.
It's a powerful technique, and it gets at not just the physical stuff, but also the emotions, the mental stuff that's all tangled up in there.
Before we get into how it works, can we go back to something you mentioned before? Mirroring those unexpressed emotions. It's kind of out there, this idea that you can feel what someone else is feeling, even if they don't say it. Can you explain that more?
It's wild, right? It kind of points to this like deep connection we all have. Blackstone calls it fundamental consciousness.
So it's more than just reading body language or listening to their tone. We're talking about something deeper.
Exactly. Like we're wired to pick up on these subtle signals, especially from people we're close to. Ever just like know what someone's thinking before they say it?
Oh yeah, for sure. It's almost like a sixth sense. But how does this fundamental consciousness thing connect to trauma and the realization process?
Okay, so Blackstone says when you go through trauma, you tend to shrink away from that connection, like it's too dangerous. You build walls to protect yourself from getting hurt again. But the problem is, you also block out good stuff, the love, the belonging.
Ugh, yeah. You're safe but lonely? It makes me think about all the ways I might be holding myself back without even knowing it. In relationships, at work, everywhere.
That's where the realization process comes in. It's not just about releasing the tension in your body. It's about gently connecting with yourself, with others, like becoming whole again.
This reminds me of how I always tense up in meetings. It's subtle, but now I realize it's probably something I picked up from my dad. He was always stressed at his job.
There you go. That's exactly how these patterns can show up. The realization process is all about noticing those little cues, those physical feelings that tell you what's going on underneath.
So, okay, we notice it. What then? Do we try to relax, make it go away?
No, it's not about fighting it. It's more like you just acknowledge it, you become aware of it, and you breathe into it.
So if instead of freaking out, you're like, hey, there you are.
Yeah, exactly. It's about being kind to yourself, accepting that this is part of you and it has something to teach you.
This is powerful stuff. It feels like even just becoming aware of these things can change so much. Like you're finally seeing yourself clearly.
That's the magic of it. Your body knows so much. When you start to listen to it, you can heal. You can really change.
This sounds almost too good to be true. Can we really undo years, decades of this stuff just by paying attention?
It's not about erasing the past. It's about changing how you relate to it. And based on what Blackstone's seen with herself and tons of people, the answer is yes. The realization process really works.
So if we're mirroring all this tension, these emotional patterns, how do we even know who we are? How do we separate what's ours from what we've picked up?
Such a good question. And that brings us to a huge part of the realization process. Differentiation. When you start letting go of detention, becoming more present in your body, you start to untangle yourself from all those patterns you absorbed.
So it's like peeling back layers until you find the real you.
Yes. The realization process helps you become who you really are, not by pushing other people away, but by realizing, hey, this is my spot in the world.
This is all blowing my mind a little. It's like trauma, how you feel in your body and how we're all connected. It's all woven together.
It is a pretty amazing tapestry, and the realization process gives us tools to untangle the knots. It's about healing and living a fuller, more authentic life.
This has been, wow, I mean, really eye-opening. The way trauma shapes us and how we can heal, not just mentally, but physically. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. But it's also hopeful, right? Seeing how resilient we are.
Okay, so much good stuff here, but our listeners are probably wondering, what now? How do you actually use this realization process?
Great question. You can start simple. Just pay attention to your breath. Notice, is it shallow, deep? Do you feel any tightness in your chest, your belly when you breathe?
So just noticing, that's a good first step.
Yeah, it's all about getting curious about what's happening inside without judging it. No need to change anything, just observe.
And as you get more aware of your breath, maybe you start noticing other sensations too.
Exactly. Maybe your shoulders are tight, your jaw's clenched, or you have that like pit in your stomach feeling.
You know, that's funny. I clench my jaw when I'm concentrating or stressed. Never thought about it before, but it makes sense now.
See? That's how sneaky these patterns are. You don't even realize they're there, but once you notice, that's a big step.
Okay, so you notice it. What then? Do you try to relax, make it go away?
Not really. It's more about just letting it be there. You acknowledge it, you feel it, and you breathe into it.
It's like instead of fighting it, you're making peace with it.
Exactly. You're being kind to yourself. You're saying, this is part of me and it's okay.
I love that. It feels like such a shift just to become aware. Like things can start to change from there.
They really can. The body's so smart. If you listen to it, it'll guide you.
This has been incredible. It feels like we've just scratched the surface, though.
We have, but that's the beauty of it. There's always more to explore.
So to wrap up our deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
That you are not defined by your trauma. It's part of you, but it doesn't have to control you. You have everything you need to heal, to be whole, to live a joyful, connected life.
Beautifully said. Thanks so much for sharing all this with us. I know I've learned a ton.
It was my pleasure.
And for our listeners, if you want to keep going deeper, don't forget to check out the resources we mentioned, Blackstone's book, Trauma and the Unbound Body, and the Realization Process website. There's so much out there to help you on your journey.
It's true. You don't have to do this alone.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
Absolutely. The journey's just beginning.